Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the seminar series, The Prospects of Criticism, part of our joint research project with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of the Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 20th of April 2023, Ole Martin Skilleås, wine writer and professor of philosophy at the University of Bergen, talks to us about the role of expertise in the aesthetic experience of wine. Not only do experienced wine tasters acquire a greater sensibility to the properties of various wines, Skilleås argues, but their expertise provides them with the structure and vocabulary necessary to make balanced, reasoned judgments about what makes certain wines successful and others not. Great. Well, let's go going. So it's our great pleasure for this latest in the series of seminars in the Prospects of Criticism series to welcome Ole Martin Skilleås from the University of Bergen, where he's professor of philosophy. Ole Martin completed his PhD, I think, already in 1992, if I read correctly, at the University of Warwick, with a dissertation on the value of interpretation in literature. And you have worked widely within philosophical aesthetics, and particularly the philosophy of literature, producing an influential volume, which I certainly have on my shelf somewhere, on an introduction to the philosophy of literature, which you published with University of Edinburgh Press back in 2001. And you have written and researched widely on a good variety of issues within philosophical aesthetics, and particularly on the concept of aesthetic expertise. And I believe you have an ongoing research project on just that question. But another long-standing research interest, driven, I think, by a equally long-standing passion for the stuff itself, has been this interest in the subject of wine and the philosophy of wine. And it's a great pleasure, therefore, that we welcome you today to talk to us on the subject of expertise and its importance in the judgments we make about wine. So welcome, Ole Martin. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for being invited. I'm going to share a screen here. I've made a PowerPoint, and as I was explaining earlier, I'm not sure if I can switch here to full mode. No, I'll just do it like this anyway. I've dispensed with PowerPoints in my teaching to students, but I think it might still be useful to do it here. Keep our attention focused. I've made a little outline, which gives you an idea of where I want to go. I've got just about 20 slides, I think, with text. So my reckoning is if I spend about a minute on each, I'll clock in at about 20 minutes, which I think is more or less the ideal length for this sort of thing. It leaves us plenty of time for discussion. So first of all, I'm going to argue that it's possible to consider wine as an aesthetic object against the objections, pardon the pun. And on this slide, there is an objection from Mark Rowe, no less. I think it was an article in the British Journal of Aesthetics at some point. And it's very useful to have some enemies, as it were. Mark's a great guy, but in this case, he came up with a quotation that was just too good not to use, and it goes pretty much like this, as you can read. Because wine does not have parts, our experience cannot be patterned by the intellect, and persuasion directed to this end is redundant. But of course, the practice of wine appreciation makes sure that wine has parts. It's, of course, an undifferentiated liquid, as it were, but the way it's set up by the practice to appreciate wine, it has a sequence and it has a duration. We go from sight, we go from first sniff to the second one, to attack, to mid-palate, to end of the tasting curve, to aftertaste, and all this makes it possible to use these locations, as it were, for drawing attention to aspects of the wine. So this settled practice gives wine parts and aspects, as I mentioned, scent and color, that allows for directed attention, and therefore also guided perception. And my key contention, I think, is that aesthetic expertise in wine, here with an emphasis on the aesthetic, does indeed rely on guided perception. It's the way to develop expertise. It's the way to well, it's an integral element of actually being a group of people engaged with an aesthetic object that you're all going to share and try and understand. So moving on, then I'm going to mention two of the key concepts that I'm going to rely on, and one of these is project. And as a sort of first pass at a definition, we can define project as the direction of attention and action towards some end, employing skills and competencies so as to achieve this end. So a project will usually involve a purpose and the direction of attention to this purpose, which of course involves ignoring as well as attending, since some aspects are necessarily more important than others, and some aspects less important, depending, of course, on the project you're engaging in. So typical projects with wine include pairing with a dish, getting drunk, impressing a guest. It has to be expensive, I guess, in order to impress the guest. And of course, determining the provenance, which is something wine geeks love to do, blind tasting. And of course, which is the subject here, enjoying the wine, attending to it, giving it its full, trying to get the full potential of the liquid out of it. And of course, all the combinations of these, and of course other projects. So then the next key concept is attention, which is known by us all, particularly when it lapses. And my idea, of course, is that your project directs attention. And one of the key research, some of you, I think maybe all of you have seen this. It's quite a famous experiment where two researchers, I can't recall their names exactly, but Chabris, I think, was one of them. And they record two groups of students. They are passing a ball between them. And the task given by the people who are then asked to watch this video is, can you count the number of times the ball is passed between members of the white team, and combinations thereof. And they're not told that in the middle of this, a person in a gorilla suit walks into the picture, stops in the middle of it, waves to the camera, and saunters out again. And of course, roughly half or more than half of the respondents didn't notice any gorilla because their attention was elsewhere. And I'm also going to say that I think this is, of course, a visual task. We'll get to an auditory example shortly. But with this visual task, I don't think it's reasonable to claim that a multi-sensory object like wine is any less likely to be the focus of this particular phenomenon of inattentional blindness. But of course, the visual example relies on obviously visual focus, and visual focus is quite narrow. The focus you have is the good focus you have is pretty much like the nail of your thumb when you extend your arm right in front of you. And that's where you can focus and determine with great accuracy color and shape. And it's you can try this at home, but it's quite surprising how far into the center of your visual field you have to go in order to determine the color of, say, a playing card. So I'm going to rely on the assumption that senses, the olfaction and the other senses involved in wine tasting are equally subject to the problem of inattentional blindness. We are, most of us, I think, familiar with the cocktail party effect. You're at a party, typically a party, and I couldn't help but recall several instances of standing outside the auditoria at St Anne's College, Oxford, during the conference of the British Society of Aesthetics, and the absolutely deafening auditory situation you're put in there. But anyway, a much more pleasant cocktail party even has this effect. You're able to focus on the conversation you're taking part in, but if something happens that takes your attention away, typically somebody dropping your name in the conversation in the same room, suddenly your attention is elsewhere and you don't listen to your conversation partner anymore. So a sharp redirection of focus based on relevance is probably the key here to the cocktail party effect. So the sensory input available is in excess of what is attended to, and I think this is pretty much the case in also in tasting wine. And so you have sensory input that you're not paying attention to, and I think, speaking from experience, trying to cast my mind back to when I was a neophyte in the world of wine, I was one of the reasons why I started getting interested in this is that tasting with other people made me realize that what had been right in front of my nose, literally speaking, were stuff that I hadn't noticed before. But my attention was brought around to this, and which made me realize that I had been, as it were, blind, or certainly inattentive to a lot of the possible sensory input that I could be attending to. So I think these are some of the keys to understanding what aesthetic expertise in wine might be about. It definitely has an element of attention. It has an element of getting aware of what might be there, which also makes you more likely to be searching for it and more likely to actually find it as you go along in your development of competence. So reasons for this might be due to processing limitations, speaking in sort of semi cognitive psychology lingo here, and the phenomenon that we often hear about, multitasking. Multitasking, research suggests, it's probably doing several projects in rapid succession rather than all at once. It's the ability to switch between different projects and tasks that makes you, makes it possible for you to similarly, so at least simulate a kind of multitasking environment. So two of the key, as it were, psychological or phenomenological, if you like, concepts done away with, over to a very familiar, for aestheticians anyway, concept, the delicacy of taste. And we know it from Hume, and the fine-grained grain distinctions that Sancho Panza's kinsman in Don Quixote came up with. They found traces of taste from the key on the leaden thong, and where that's the way Hume uses it anyway, to say that these people, from this literary example anyway, had delicacy of taste because they were able to pick out nuances of taste that the objective correlates that were found at the bottom of the barrel finally could sort of testify to. So there's one sense, as we know, of the sensory detection, which this was an example of, and then the use that Hume puts it to, which is the judgment of taste. So I'm coming back to that, but I'll take a little detour through one of the red herrings in this debate, which are super tasters. Super tasters are definitely a dead end in the search for what aesthetic expertise in wine might be all about, because super tasters have more taste buds, and very often the super tasters, which do definitely exist, they are less likely to be interested in wine because it tastes too bitter for them. It just tastes too much. It's unpleasant. So searching for super tasters in this context is, as I said, a dead end. But what about other kinds of sensory exceptionalism? Some people claim to be able to detect things that others do not. But in the realm of the aesthetic, and particularly in the realm of aesthetic experts being used for recommendations or being used for education or whatever, they are just of no use, because if such people do exist, they are in a sensory realm of their own, and their experiences and judgments have no relevance beyond this realm. So the sensory exceptionalism is also, I think, even in a wider context than the super tasters, just a dead end. So here we are over to a study. It's about 20 years old now, but it's still one of the few that's been done on this topic. The superior olfactory recognition by wine judges, which is apparently a well-documented effect. They are the olfactory sensitivity of wine experts are pretty much similar to those of novices, and the wine experts did not perform better than novices on the verbal memory tasks. So it's not down to a superior verbal memory, and the ability to recognize odors and ability to name odors were not positively correlated. So the conclusion in this study by Wendy Parr and others was that experts were superior in sensory-based memory, i.e. experience, episodic memory, right? To put it quite bluntly. And the novices in this, in case you wonder, were wine science students who at this stage, being in the education part, had mainly been educated in analyzing wine, taking wines apart. And before you rush to the police and charge me with advertising for alcohol here, which is it's against the law in Norway. This wine I actually tasted yesterday, and it was foul. I can tell you that it was foul. But the name was kind of intriguing, so that's why I took a picture of it to use it as an illustration today. I was before I tasted that, I thought, maybe I should give that as a present to people who just passed their doctorate, but no, I don't want to do that. Definitely not. Anyway, I was detoured. So detection and sensitivity in the aesthetic expertise of wine, I think, is necessary, but it's far from sufficient. Standards of accuracy and achievement make them suitable for, standards of accuracy and achievement, like the ones in the study from Wendy Parr, make them suitable for science and experiment. But the cognitive part is relatively neglected by science. How we perceive, how we conceptualize, how we classify, remember, judge, and communicate about wine. Sensory science tends to leave that in the open. So that's something we have to try and conceptualize, try and understand in other ways. So in short, the aesthetics of wine and aesthetic expertise in wine relates to how we make sense of and appreciate wines. And that's the suprasensory meaning of delicacy of taste, the way it's being used also by Hume in the famous essay. So it's the ability to make sensitive and sensible judgments of taste, but to what end? And that takes me to the last part of this presentation, which is about the reviewer and the critic. So these are two main projects in the aesthetic judgment of wine for an audience. Reviewing, recommending, relying on verdicts. This is what you see in the media and what I do on my blog. This picture was taken yesterday at a wine monopoly organized tasting. I have you probably can't see, but there's a small badge on my shirt that says press. So I'm I'm invited as a journalist to these events. And what I do in my blog is I recommend some wines, tell others to tell you to stay away from others, and the rest of it. It's familiar to us all, I'm guessing. But criticism, wine criticism, is more holistic. It's analytic. It's teaching. It's guiding, and it's what I and a lot of other people do when we conduct tasting courses, and we try and induce people into wine appreciation. So clearly, there's an overlap in a review. If you can point to something that justifies your verdict, that's probably a good thing. And similarly, there's an overlap going the other way. But criticism, of course, goes into what and how, into the what and the how of the wine, detailing and comparing elements, but always with a view to showing how this makes it successful or not. So criticism tends to require a dynamic conversation, such as when sharing a wine and discussing it. Of course, it's possible to learn from wine, just reading or whatever. But the dynamics, going backwards and forwards, being able to use the regulatory aspect, sort of sequence of wine tasting from the visual down to the aftertaste is useful for this kinds of guidance. So coming to the end, I was, I suppose, due to come up with some conclusions, and here are some. So the aesthetic judgment of wine is made possible by an aesthetic practice. It's a fairly set way of going about things. And expertise in wine is relative to projects. What you do with wine is, most of the time it's a liquid you pay little attention to. It goes well with the dish you make, you're eating. It gets you suitably tipsy or whatever. But it's also possible, at least with some wines, to actually enjoy it in the way that we are used to approach art objects, or at least in ways quite similar. So sensory competence is necessary, but not sufficient for aesthetic expertise in wine. And reviewing is distinct from criticism, as are success criteria for either. And the development and application of aesthetic expertise in wine relies on guided perception. So that's my the end of my conclusions so far.
Thanks very much indeed, Ole Martin. That was really interesting, and also very concise, which gives us lots of time for questions. And as usual, the easiest way for people to ask questions is to raise their virtual hand. So Elizabeth has already raised her hand, which is very quick off.
But I can wait. I can be patient.
No, there's no need for that. You can go right ahead.
Good. Thank you so much, Ole Martin. That made a lot of sense to me, and I thought it, clear and helpful in thinking about the philosophy of wine. I just had a question about, one of the things that interests us in our project, which has to do with the critical vocabulary and the terminology. And you touched on it, and again, it was very helpful right at the end when you talked about criticism as a kind of conversation, as a kind of a dialogue. And I wonder why that is, or if you would say that there is a stronger element of that when we talk about wine than when we talk about, say a painting. Because one of the things that I don't know a lot about wine, but one of the things that strikes me when we try to describe or make a judgment about wine is the kind of words, the kind of concepts that we use that I often find not at all helpful. Like grapefruit or blackberry, all sorts of, like sandalwood, all sorts of things that I can't really connect it with my actual sensory experience. And that seems to be a different kind of discussion or a different kind of exchange than you have when you can, maybe that's an oversimplified picture, but when you can point to things or listen up to things. So could you say something about why you would say that there's a special aspect, which is this conversational or you're doing it together in a certain kind of way? Is that in any way to do with the kind of critical language and concepts that we have, or not at all?
I think we are, one of the reasons why I got interested in wine and aesthetics to begin with is that we as humans have pulled our noses too far from the ground. We don't use olfaction all that much. It's might often be to avoid things. So the olfactory element of wine, I think, is one of the reasons why we don't have too much of a vocabulary already established. Going to see, listening to music, seeing art, most of the other sort of canonical parts of the fine arts spectrum relate to senses that we use far more extensively in our daily lives. So one of the things that you need to develop when you enter the world of wine is a vocabulary. And when I started out, I just was left in awe. If I got a good wine, I was left in awe, but I had no ways of talking about it. I had no ways of investigating further, other than just take another sip and go ooh and ah and whatever. So that was one of the key elements when I first started in the Wine Appreciation Society. And I could sit with other tasters tasting the same wine, and they would talk about it. And gradually, I developed not only a vocabulary, but I managed to sort of triangulate and calibrate the way I used my sort of rudimentary wine language with what they were talking about, and gradually things started to make more sense. And unless you have those, as it were, pegs to relate to develop, to re-identify elements to integrate and compare and contrast, you pretty much left sort of floating on the ocean like a cork, extending the metaphor a little bit here. So that's why, one of the reasons why I emphasize this guided perception so much, because it relates to my own experience of entering this realm, and it's also instructive to see just how much the education of the true sort of wine experts rely on this, because one of the key aspects of or parts of the education to become a master of wine is you are appointed a mentor, and the mentor and you taste a hell of a lot of wine over a long period of time. You're calibrating, going through all different kinds, and discussing thoroughly. So guided perception obviously is recognized both implicitly and explicitly in this extremely arduous education. It sounds like a lot of fun, drink a lot of wine over a long period of time, but it's I haven't done it, but it's really actually hard work. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I have a follow-up, but I put myself at the end of the queue again, so so maybe I'll get a chance to ask it later. But thanks so much. That is very helpful.
Thanks both very much. Eileen.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. So one thing I liked that you were doing was separating out these projects of recommending and criticizing. And so one thing that just made me wonder, with art, do we typically separate them? And if we don't, maybe we should, like, anyway, so that was sort of one just kind of general question. And I think maybe I do separate them a little bit with art, but I hadn't thought about the fact that I do. But so then with art, I'm quite interested in the possibility of works not succeeding as art very well, like being really problematic, flawed works, and yet being really worth criticizing. Like you can give interesting criticism of them. It's worth thinking about why they fail. And I'm wondering if that is at all possible, like for your horrible PhD wine, like, is there anything interesting to say about a bad wine, or does that not really make sense?
It does make sense. Responding to the last part of what you were saying, it does make sense. And I find, particularly if you become more and more competent, the really interesting wines are the ones that just fail to be truly amazing. Why is it that they just fail in being that? But of course, to take as an example the PhD wine, I had high hopes, with a name like that. I had high hopes for it, but it was maybe it would be interesting for a neophyte, just explaining, this wine has alcohol. That's how it can be recommended for, why it can be recommended for drinking. Hold your nose and try and drink it. Because the aromatics and the taste were completely out of sync. It tasted like, it smelled like my late grandmother's bathing salts, and it tasted way too bitter. Just to mention two things. So definitely in developing some sort of competence, you need, back to Hume, you need a broad basis of experience. You need to make comparisons from either end of the spectrum and between. And going back to the early distinction between reviewing and criticism, I think maybe it's more evident with consumer products. After all, you can go and buy wines. You can go and buy records. You find reviews in newspapers about recordings, new novels, and whatever that have stars and points and the rest of it, a bit like wine. But if you really want to learn about music or literature or whatever, you need to go more deeply, and maybe even start with things that or objects that don't need recommending because they're accepted as being worthy of interest to begin with.
I could come back a little, but I'd rather hear other things, and maybe I'll come back later.
Sure.
Well, we have plenty of time, which is great. Andrew, you are next.
Thanks very much. It's a really interesting, very interesting talk. So I'm wondering about how you think as a critic of the role of personal idiosyncrasy in the sort of criticism that you write. Also, how you think of it, the relevance of that for a reviewer too, and the reviewer criticism distinction that you drew. But things like not particularly liking New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, or not liking the style of Rioja or something like this. And you can appreciate that other people like that, but you may not like it yourself, or not liking, very oaky California Chardonnays. So when you have that kind of a recognition of a personal idiosyncrasy, how does that factor into criticism, and how do you see that influencing the criticism that you do?
It's easier to answer with regard to reviewing, definitely. I'll try and come back to this. But to start with, I write more sort of philosophical psycho/sensory science stuff for a Norwegian magazine called Vin Forum, Wine Forum. And the editor is he's a master of wine. The first in Norway, and one of barely 300, I think, in the world. Anyway, so I've talked a lot with him, and I know his preferences. I know what he likes, and I noticed that his reviews give top marks to wine that he absolutely does not like. And I say, how can you do this? Well, I have a pretty developed idea of the ideal wine of this particular kind, and this hits all the spots. I wouldn't spend 5 kroner on it myself, but it's worth recommending to people who actually like this sort of stuff. Whoever they might be. And similarly, it's interesting, I think, because over time, when you've been a geek like I have over some 20 years or so, the reviewers. You have calibrated with recommendations and what they say about wine for a long time. And I'm able, I think, to factor in their particular likes and dislikes. And I'm able to spot, maybe not in the points they're giving, but in the words they're using, which wines they truly recommend. And I did, if you pardon me for going on a little bit here, I did some experiments some years back. There was a forum for wine geeks in Norway on the internet, and I before there was a lot of tasting notes out on the internet, and I picked some tasting notes about the same wine from different reviewers, and I mixed them a bit and said, can you tell which 2 of these 3 tasting notes are about the same wine? And I very often got a reply back, no, but I can tell that tasting note is written by X, and that tasting note is written by Y. And this was brought out actually because a friend of mine in the linguistics department, he used machine learning for his master's students. Set them a task there, and one of the students tried to find out if the machine could learn, based on a number of tasting notes and texts, which wine a particular tasting note related to, and it couldn't. But it could tell who had written it. So reviewing, at least in wine, seems to be, as you were saying, very idiosyncratic. Each have their own style in writing about wine, and I probably do that myself. And it's possible, as I said, over time to calibrate, to make up some sort of, if you like, aesthetic profile of different reviewers, so that you're able to, as it were, navigate what they're saying much better. I have, by the way, a friend who says he only goes to see films that are panned by a particular reviewer, and he avoids like the plague the ones she praises. So there are ways of using calibration to sort of navigate in your aesthetic life. So that's reviewing. Criticism, well, I don't know. Criticism, if I try and go deeply into a wine, it's almost invariably around the table with other people similarly afflicted. We tend to share some tastes and differ on others. So whenever you go detailed into it, like you were, as if one were sort of writing an academic criticism of a poem or a novel or whatever, it's always in close contact with the object itself, and then you really need to be with other people.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, you're next on my virtual list.
Not sure this is quite a question, but to understand the difference between a reviewer and a critic, just wondering what you think of controversial super tasters like Robert Parker, who have a pretty extraordinary ability in respect to a certain kind of wine and acknowledges it falls apart, for example, with any wines from the Americas. He's not particularly interested in conversation, at least not in the sense that you seem to be outlining. So would somebody like that, it's a bit of an, seems at times almost autistic in the way he approaches this. Would he really be a reviewer on your model rather than a critic?
Yes, he would be.
Okay.
But so supremely influential as nobody in the world of wine will ever be again, because he came in at a time when things were starting to explode in many ways. The wine public was expanding substantially. People were getting more higher education, more wealthy. Wine had its cachet of being associated with the good life. Wine science in terms of all the way from agriculture all the way to into the bottle was developing. So you had an explosion on both ends, and Parker was able to by means of one-upmanship position himself in the Ralph Nader of wine, and he had an influence that's just amazing. And as I said, it's not going to be replicated ever again. And he influenced not only the wine buying public, he influenced other writers, and he influenced to a very, very great extent wine producers. Because if you didn't get at least 90 points from Parker, you might as well pack up. I remember a friend, American friend. I remember just this sentence that stuck in my mind from one of our conversations. That said, "I know exactly what the Parker 90-point wine tastes like." So that's how calibrated he was, because he was one of the first subscribers to Wine Advocate. I don't know if that answered your question. I gave a very short answer to begin with, but given the influence of Parker is like no other reviewer ever, I think.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. I put myself on the list. I hope that's okay, because it's really a fascinating area, and really, in a way, captures so many of the key facets of criticism in very general terms within art, but in a kind of organized and systematic environment. And the thing that really struck a chord with me was that you characterized the overall project of wine criticism as being concerned with explaining or giving an account of why that wine is successful or not. The kind of like reasons you give and the properties that you adduce and the properties that you single out as part of the build-up of the experience and of the judgment making really culminate in this sense that the wine is successful for all of these reasons. And what struck me as interesting is obviously that model bears striking resonance with formalist enterprises within literary criticism. So in particular, for example, the New Critics or formalists, where for example, Beardsley and Wimsatt use almost exactly that phrase when they're talking about what to do with the question of authorial intention in the novel. That if it plays a meaningful role in explaining the success of the work itself, then it's relevant. But it's part of that. It's not to be singled out as something separate. And I just wondered, does your interest in wine color your conception of the philosophy of literature and literary criticism more generally? Because it's such a neat package. I mean, the other phrase that you mentioned, which stuck out, was when you were talking about the Hume example, the Sancho Panza example. You used the phrase objective correlative for the things that they find in the barrel of wine, which is, of course, T.S. Eliot's model for the things in the world that ground our aesthetic judgments, and was, of course, also very influential on formalist new criticism, etc., etc. So I just wondered if your interest in wine and the very kind of neat package where you really can, often with scientific support, point to features where a wine is insufficiently balanced, or this and that. Or where bitterness is something that really can be too much, and it's just a condition where you say this is actually destroying the wine. There's no argument about it. Whether this colours your sense of the entire project.
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought of myself at that meta level before, but maybe there is a connection. But it goes the other way in that case, I think, because I started out with literature. I was coming quite late to wine, but quite early to literature. And I wrote my master's thesis, hovedfag thesis, that was called back in the day, on Steinhug Olsen's institutional theory of literature. And started corresponding with Peter Lamar quite early. So if you're wanting to sort of trace the roots, I think you might find that they're going in that direction. And the idea of constitutive criteria for an institution with shared assumptions, ways of doing things and stuff, and that's bears resemblance, I think, to the way I'm thinking about wine and how I try to conceptualize wine as an aesthetic practice. The practice element, and also the community element in shared valuations and stuff. So I think there might be a connection, but in terms of influence, it might be going the other way.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. I do have a follow-up, but I'll join the others in putting myself back to the back of the queue. Thanks very much. Eileen.
Elizabeth, do you want to go first?
No, thank you. I really want to hear your question.
Okay. I sort of have two questions. You could choose one. One is because you've been talking about kind of dialogue and conversation about wine, and you've been talking about, as it were, the cognitive penetration, or the role of cognition in wine experience and judgment. Have you, can someone else really change how you think and then appreciate a wine? Has that happened to you, where, say, you've thought, this isn't very good, or this is so good, or something, but then you come to understand it differently and change. Okay, so that's one question. But the other thing is about wines fitting into occasions, and the sense in which it seems like a great wine could be wrong for the occasion. Like, it's Tuesday night, you're having leftovers. You don't pull out the great wine. So anyway, those are just two kind of different issues that are brought to the surface for me.
No, yes to both. That's the short answer. And yeah, I've have experienced, and people have reported experiencing that the wine has come apart when somebody else been talking about them, and the other way around. Realizing how this is supposed to work, how it works. That you had seeing the bitterness as being too much in conflict with X, but you actually, once you pay attention to it and you notice the way it sort of lingers into the aftertaste, it does something to connect the whole that you hadn't paid attention to before. So that's the experiential background for me, putting such an emphasis on attention, because it was all there before I noticed these things, but having him pointed out to me made me realize, and made me, to speak in sort of highfalutin terms, constitute the aesthetic object in a different manner. And yes, to the other question, there are definitely right and wrong occasions for wines, and this is your take-home reviewer's message to you. Don't spend champagne on great occasions. Drink them at home with your partner or some good friends on a Tuesday night, because such a great wine is wasted on a great occasion. The great occasion gets in the way of the wine, or if you're a wine geek like me, the great wine gets in the way of the occasion. So the two shouldn't mix. As I was saying at some point, it was a lie, but it was a good line anyway, that Tuesday night was champagne night in our house.
Terrific. We can move on to Elizabeth's follow-up or question.
Thank you. I'm still smiling from that last comment. Very nice. My question, or my follow-up question, goes back again to what one maybe could refer to as the, how do we start with a critical language for a certain object of appreciation? So it's a question that you could extend to anything, but in relation to wine, I mean, you said some helpful things about, how we enter into that kind of dialogue with each other, also in response to Andrew's question. And you mentioned, yes, it tastes a bit like my grandmother's bathing salts. And although none of us have smelled your grandmother's bathing salts, we know exactly what you mean by that. It's still a very personal kind of reference, right? So my question is really, how does the critical language of wine get going? Which seems right to me, I think to all of us, that so many of the terms or the concepts or the metaphors involved are, in acquaintance or inexperience, kind of inaccessible to us. So there's a lot of kind of imagination going on. There's some metaphor. There's a lot of extrapolation. There's some association. There's quite a lot happening. Or it seems to me there's quite a lot happening in order for us all to be able to latch on to some kind of common conceptual ground from which we can then start building a certain critical language. Does that sound right to you? But I mean, how does it all start? I mean, I know I'm kind of obsessing about the grapefruit, but how does something like that get going?
Well, the grapefruit, that's quite easy to answer, because there's nothing like grapefruit sort of. It's not it's not an elementary particle, so to speak, but it's an ester, and it can also be found in wine. What you smell from the grapefruit can also be found in wine, or but usually not alone, obviously, which is why it's not exactly like a grapefruit. So some such elements are part of a referential vocabulary that you can actually experience outside wine. Then you have another vocabulary that's at a slightly higher level. It's more compounds, right? And at the level above that again, you have the aesthetic terms, and very often I find that the truly great ones, the ones that you sort of remember for forever. A common feature is that nothing sticks out. You're left with only the aesthetic vocabulary of elegance, harmony, depth, profundity. So So it's it's almost literally as you move up the hierarchy, you get to the aesthetic vocabulary. You can use it, but the truly amazing stuff, that's what you only use the aesthetic vocabulary for. But as we was talking about initially, I think with your first question, it's from the outside, the vocabulary of wine speak seems very strange, and some sort of cultivate that strangeness. Others try and be more specific, down to earth, but then it tends to be a list of it's like the greengrocer section of a supermarket, which is not very helpful. So what I try and do in my tasting notes is to talk more about the general features, the structure and stuff of the wine, rather than sort of loose use one volume of botany to describe a wine. So, but sometimes, particularly when sitting around the table tasting with others, sometimes a metaphor, just some sort of line, just nails it. Sometimes, yeah, that's exactly it. But that would mean nothing to the people outside the room who did not have the wine in their glasses. So that's why I think in order to truly develop competence in wine, you definitely need to be in the situation where you're tasting with others.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes left, and if there is nobody else, I'll take the liberty of asking my own follow-up. Hope that's okay. It's related to what Elizabeth was just talking about, and it reminded me that we had Elizabeth and I, who have children in common, as you all know, were having dinner with our daughter the other day and talking about wine and the fact that children and grown-ups have different taste buds. And Cecilia very sharply remarked, "You mean you just got more that have died, or you have fewer?" So she was quite smug about that. But it was interesting what you were saying about super tasters, that you exclude this category from the realm of expertise on the grounds that they just occupy a different sensory realm to a certain extent. And at the same time, you're using a model where through the acquisition of a methodology and the acquisition of a kind of structure and a community and a language within that community, that if not the sensory features themselves, that the experience of distinctions and the ability to recall things, all this improves through expertise and experience. And I just wondered, that's obviously true too in music and in the visual art, that the more we read criticism and talk to critics, and we can kind of educate ourselves up, so we can too participate in this realm. I just wondered to what extent you think that when one enters a realm which is facilitated by a great deal of education, for example, the realm occupied by these masters of wine, which is an extraordinary process to go through, as you mentioned, that in itself puts you in a separate realm from most people who enjoy a glass or two of wine. So the question is really, is there a point at which one acquires too much expertise and therefore loses contact with the people that one would try to bring up with you to occupy the same community or form part of the same community?
I don't know. But super tasters are definitely, that's to do with the number of receptors on your tongue and in your mouth. I strongly suspect my son is one of them. He's in his early 20s, 20 now, and his food just can't be bland enough. He really reacts to anything that's strong in any direction, which is sad because I need to sell my wine before I die. but the people who are beyond the realm, those are sensorially, if they do exist, dogs, for instance, hear reaches of sound that we can't hear, and similar stuff. They are, if they were to exist, they would be useless to us. But the truly super competent, the masters of wine, they are in part judged on their ability to communicate, to write and speak comprehensively and understandably about the objects of wine. So I don't think we need to worry about them. They are still here among us. But they, I've tasted many times with Arne Ronald, this master of wine, and the way he can just take a wine and completely pull it apart has left me gasping many times. I've sort of, I think you're right, but how the hell did you notice, sort of thing. So it's but also it has to be said, another guy I know, he was a Nordic champion sommelier some 10-15 years ago, and I'm tasting with him now fairly regularly, and he says, it's like a long distance runner. If you don't keep it up, you'll sort of fall behind. I'm nowhere like where I was 10-15 years ago. You just have to keep it up. You just have to go at it in order to keep up, because it's not like riding a bike. It's not something you achieve once and for all. It's something you really have to keep up.
Certainly so, and I'm sure that's true, and with other forms of aesthetic engagement. So that was terrific and interesting and a bit different, but also hugely relevant and exciting for all of us. So thanks very much, Ole Martin.
Thanks for turning up.
Just to say before everyone leaves, or those of us still here leave, we have the next seminar is in 2 weeks' time on the 4th of May with Eileen John. So that's very exciting at the usual time, usual virtual place. So thanks very much, everyone, today, and thanks particularly Ole Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this recorded seminar in the series The Prospect of Criticism, part of the Templeton-funded research project, Knowledge, Perception and the Prospects of Criticism. If you'd like to find out more about the project, to learn about upcoming events or watch other recordings in the seminar series, please go to our website www.knowledgeperceptioncriticism.com.